Blah Blah, a show about careers, getting ahead, and for some of you, just getting out of your parents' basement. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Joni Cole, and I work about as far away from a corner office as you can imagine. I'm an author, a freelance writer, a professional editor, and I've never really had a job for longer than 2 years at a time. So I bring the perspective of the self-employed and also from someone who gets to work from her kitchen.
I'm Tracy. I'm your human resources insider. I want you to love what you do and find your passion at work. I've seen the good, bad, and the what were you thinking. I can share the inside thinking from management and HR, whether you're making career choices or facing an unexpected challenge on the job.
And I'm Becky. I've helped thousands of college students launch and navigate their careers. There's nothing better than seeing talent in action, and there's nothing worse than talent that has no home. I bring the perspective of the job search trials, tribulations, and triumphs, and a healthy dose of job market news.
Today we're talking about managing a heavy workload. Is it an opportunity to show what you're made of, or unfair pressure that keeps you from doing your best work and losing important work-life balance? Our guest today is Susan, who said enough is enough when her manager would not adjust the volume of her work assignments. Is it reasonable for an employee to shut off at the end of the day, or will that result in low performance appraisals, fewer pay increases, and lack of interesting work assignments? And is that fair? Susan, tell us about the moment you knew you couldn't take it anymore.
Tracy, I don't think it's really a moment. I think that anyone who is experienced and cares about the work that they do expects that sometimes you'll have days or weeks or even months where you're expected to put your personal life and the other things you want to do on the back burner because of work pressure and workload. But I think one day you wake up and you look back at the last 3 months or 6 months and you realize, you're like, oh, wait a minute, I haven't given blood, I haven't met with my friends, I haven't been to the gym in 3 months. Or you just notice that your daughter's no longer surprised when you say, Mommy's too tired, she needs to take a bath and can't talk to you or watch a show. So I think it's, I really don't think it's one moment. I think there is a moment when you just look back and say, this isn't right, this isn't what I was looking for.
And so what was the straw that broke the camel's back? How did you decide to not stay and instead to leave the job?
Well, I think, like I said, after about 3 months or so, that's when I had the first conversation with my manager, and we actually had a strategic meeting with our whole team, and I talked about the fact that I really felt that my workload was something that should be 2 people, and there were sort of 2 different parts of my job that were difficult to do at the same time, where I had sort of events and things that were big workloads from time to time, and then also was expected to do a regular sort of day-to-day work as well, and that was very difficult to manage those two parts of my job together, especially given that both of them were more than I felt one person could do. So everyone agreed that I was correct, that my workload and responsibilities were too much, and that something should be done. And we tried a few things. We had a temp for a few months, and some other things were tried. But it was really the day where I realized I'd been at my job for 1 year, and that my workload was more than it had been when I started. And so even though about 3 to 4 months into the job, we'd had that first discussion, and everyone agreed that everything I was saying was valid, but there we were a year later, and nothing had actually changed. And that's when I realized that perhaps nothing would change, and that I needed to make, that I needed to be the one who made a change.
So Susan, I think though, when you're in the manager's seat, you're really going to be frustrated by someone who's not able to just make it work, and whether that's fair or not. The people who are moving to the top are the ones that just keep taking it on, and they put in those extra hours or checking in after work. They're the ones who are really going to be the recipient of kind of those rewards. And so I'm just wondering where you're, kind of where you personally are in that spectrum of knowing that you probably wouldn't be promoted or given maybe more of the pay raises in comparison to people who are knocking themselves out to deliver the work.
Tracy, I was knocking myself out, and so everyone was happy with the work that I was doing except for me. I was knocking myself out, and I was getting the work done. There was nothing that wasn't getting done except my work-life balance. And so also the situation is the reason why I do what I do. I'm an administrative professional, and so the reason I chose to do that is because I wanted to have a life that was work-life balance, and I'm not someone who's on this career track where I want these promotions and I want to just keep moving up. I'm someone who wants to come in every day and do good work and still, go home and have, have a life. And so,
and I do think this begs the question of, like, as a company, it's hard to find good people, right? And so, I think it's assumed that the employees are just going to take it and take it and take it. But truthfully, when does it end? Like, who is going to stand there and say, you know what, everybody's overworked. Let's rethink these processes. And isn't that part of the manager's job to make sure that the people are able to, go home sometimes and to not feel like they're completely overwhelmed? And I think it's just we're all pushing it so much.
I want to jump in from somebody who's quit as many jobs as I've had, and I thought it was a really interesting analogy, an aha moment, Susan, when you were talking about, you suddenly realized, when do I give blood, and when am I home with my children? And I thought that was a good analogy, the giving blood, because I think many managers expect you to give blood, figuratively, of course, but, to really be there 110%. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. But what I keep hearing is, and again, from the perspective of somebody who has quit a lot of jobs, is you can try to finesse here, finesse there, and you and your managers who are happy with your work tried to do that over and over again, and it only made the problem worse. It almost seems like when the fit's wrong, it's wrong. You want to give blood, but you don't want to give it at work. And I don't know, maybe, I defer to Becky and Tracy, but can that be fixed? If the fit is wrong, somebody doesn't want it, they're a good worker, they're doing good work, the employer likes them very much, the employee doesn't necessarily want to quit, but if the fit's not there, when do you cut your losses on both sides? And I'm someone who, I cut my losses pretty quickly if the job isn't a good fit, or at least for that time in my life.
I guess from my perspective, I'm not sure that I heard it wasn't a good fit, that the job itself, but that there was a lot of work and that Susan maintains her balance better than probably a lot of other employees. But I think that the challenge is that the manager probably has 5 other people who are willing to give up all of their balance, is answering their messages at night, is staying after, who's doing it. And is that good? Probably not. But there's lots of people who are willing to do that. So how do we make sense?
And so Joni's saying it's not a good fit for her, because she's identifying, look, they're never going to change. So similar to Susan, she's saying, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not. Yeah. And that's the intriguing part to me, is I think sometimes there are really good people who they just want to give 98%. Yeah. They don't want to give 120% and climb the ladder. And are we losing those people, or are they just, if you can't cut it, you can't,
Okay, well,
somebody else.
Is it a thing where the first solution is to look at how to size the job down? Because often that doesn't seem to work. The job is the job. Or are there some incremental steps? Because what I love is, Susan didn't just, cut bait and leave. The employer didn't just say, well, okay, then I guess you're not what we want. And they look for incremental steps. But if the first step is, how can we size this job down? Are there other steps that can be, because that hardly ever happens. The job often can't be sized down. Are there other steps so that this employee can stay employed where she wants at a job she likes, but not feel like she's failing in a way? And the employer doesn't have to lose someone as good as Susan. What are some of the real world solutions to make that fit between a good employer and a good employee work better, especially if it's related to workload?
And I think it begs the question of, does that mean you can't get to the top, you can't succeed unless you are giving yourself away?
Yeah, good point.
So I think there's an interesting concept in the restaurant industry. A friend of mine worked at Starbucks as the head of strategy, and he would set up these he and I were traveling through some restaurants, and he pointed out to me, he goes, this is a restaurant that's really well run. And he pointed out, he said, it's because there's one person standing in the back and they're watching the workload. They're watching who's doing what, and they're transferring, responsibilities, and then that person can fill in when someone like Susan is overloaded. And I often wonder, is like, are there more creative solutions? Like, rather than everybody just, the boss saying you have to take it and the employees saying I'm not going to take it, like, isn't there a structural issue maybe with the fact that everybody's overwhelmed and nobody's really just managing the work?
Also, I don't know. I'd just like to add something to this conversation. It turns out actually I gave my notice and I left, and in the process of the transition, some of the workload was actually taken off of this position. And I've seen the job description for the new posting, and it is now a manageable job that I'm even almost tempted to apply for myself.
Oh my God!
But except that I really do, now that I'm a little burned out, I want a few months off before I go back to work, or at least a few months working part-time. But
you're going to have to give back your bowl.
But that to me is the craziest part about it, is that because I was able to do the job of 1.5, 2 people, but then the realization is that probably when someone leaves in a job, that's the opportunity to rewrite the job description. That's the opportunity to transfer some things to other departments. Why is it so hard while someone's there, because they've signed up for whatever it is, to make those changes and keep someone really valuable to the team?
I think it involves reassigning tasks, and if somebody's already doing the job, it's awful hard to reassign it. But I think you really offer an insight, especially from an outsider who's left jobs. Some of it, again, wasn't because I didn't like my employer or wasn't doing a good job, though there was certainly times like that, but was that if there was too much work, often it was they weren't working towards my strength. I'm a writer and a structural editor, and if they'd also have me filling the stapler or writing things that weren't my strength and why they hired me in the first place. Suddenly, a job that was manageable and I was really contributing to the party with became bigger and bigger and bigger. And I wonder, Tracy or Becky, is it if you can prioritize the tasks, you could size the job down to why you hired that person in the first place and what their strengths are, and it speaks to their strengths. They feel better about their job, and they're not overwhelmed by doing this and this and this and this and this. I mean, is that a way to look at the tasks themselves and see if they could be reassigned sooner rather than later?
Well, actually, that's a good segue to how we close our show with the moral of the story. And I guess I would say, what a great example Susan gave of standing up for herself. It's hard to do with a manager, and you probably have to have a little bit lined up to make sure you could walk away from the job. But I think if someone watched our show and went back to work and thought of how to have a good conversation with their manager about the talents they bring to the table and the fact that if they're balanced, they're actually going to produce really great work, and that it's something that you really value as a professional, and see if you can't negotiate a way to have your job structured so that it's a win-win for both of you. And I think I really liked, Susan, how you kind of closed it, which is I'd hate to know that if I leave this job, you come to the conclusion to restructure this work, and that we could come to some agreement together about how to let me stay and have some work-life balance.
And my moral is, I'm assuming, and I'm giving everybody here the benefit of the doubt, we're all good at our jobs, and I think we all have the best intentions. And sometimes it can be, our fault if we're not managing our own workload. But really the moral for me is, I think we all as managers, we have to step up and say, look, sometimes these workloads are just a little bit insane. And understand that you can't tell somebody, prioritize, and then continue to throw work at them without really, every once in a while, stepping back and looking at the nature of work and what your organization's priorities are, not just whether that individual can handle the workload.
And my takeaway is I really admire Susan. Don't be afraid to quit. But what I loved about it is she didn't do it impulsively. She didn't do it emotionally, though there's a ton of emotion related to this. She gave it the time it needed to try to work out a solution. But when all is said and done, if the fit doesn't feel right, there is another job out there. And it's never easy, but I admire that. You don't be afraid to quit. You cannot live a life and feel really unhappy, especially when you give it a whole year to try to make it work. So I thought that was great.
And maybe if you're Susan,
don't be afraid.
Yeah, and maybe if you're Susan, you get to reapply for your newly written job description once they repost it. So
well, I've been rehired at jobs that I quit at and was laid off at and fired from, and it was very much because of what Susan said. They redefined the job.
Yeah.
And I got hired back, and it's interesting. So it's
it can happen.
It can happen in a whole bunch of different ways.
That's great. So this is Job Blah Blah, and we thank you all for watching.
Yeah, come back.
And Susan, we'll keep an eye for where you land. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.